we started to reshape the narrative of these struggling companies and entrepreneurs within the nation, because we always felt like there was a better story to tell, right? And often your reality is the story you tell yourself. And so we would sit with these CEOs and bring the most powerful, innovative media solutions to say, hey, I know things are tough. I know sometimes you want to go home and hide under your bed and, find 5 ice creams to eat and just, go to sleep. But actually, there's a way to view this differently. And so we would sit with these CEOs and they would hand us a bunch of their problems. They would hand us a bunch of kind of their vision that they thought was dead. And they would say, we don't know where we're going right now. And so our team would sit in a room. We called it the creative trust room, where we would throw different ideas around and come back and present a new story to these CEOs and leaders of companies. And they would say, that's exactly what's on our heart. You've given us hope again, and this is what we want to do. And so I saw the power of story give vision back to people. Number 2, I saw this power of story give hope to people. And number 3, I saw the power of story, actually get investment where it seemed like investment was impossible.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You will hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested. Hi, freedom fighters. Today I want you to actively engage your imagination. Imagine that after a hard-fought contest, you've just become the leader of one of the most powerful nations in the world. You're now considered the leader of the free world and considered a leader amongst leaders. A leader of a country that's highly respected and looked up to by the rest of the world. And you've become a leader at one of the most uncertain and turbulent times in the world. A world filled with fear and the threat of World War III breaking out at any day. A world where the nuclear weapons race threatens the very existence of the planet itself. You find yourself in a predicament where a hostile communist power has set up a nuclear missile base in a neighbouring country just 90 miles off the coast, where mid-range missiles could destroy all of your capital cities. And underlying this constant threat of worldwide annihilation, you've inherited the leadership of a country in a world that is divided and challenged on every front. A world of black or white, but very little grey. Of East against West. Of communism versus democracy, religion versus politics, Catholic against Protestant, black against white, rich against poor. A world where fighting and war are the default approaches to solving problems and eliminating enemies. And imagine that this is a world that doesn't enjoy the provisions or protections that we currently enjoy today, and for most part take for granted. Imagine that as the newly elected leader, you've inherited a country struggling to come out of an economic recession. You're the leader of a powerful country that has the lowest rate of economic growth of any major industrialised society in the world, significantly limiting the strength and vitality of the nation. A country where $9 billion of food lays unused and rotting despite a hungry world. A country where 4 million people wait every month for a food package from the government. A nation where children are taking home part of their school lunch in order to feed their families. A time when the Soviet Union is churning out twice as many scientists and engineers. A nation where most school teachers are poorly paid and children are going to school on part-time shifts. A nation still suffering from race segregation, separation and inequality, where the citizens of colour are not afforded equal rights nor equal opportunities, causing a rising tide of discontent that's spilling out into heated demonstrations and violent fights on the streets in many towns and cities. A racial powder keg waiting to explode. This is a time in many parts of the country where someone of coloured skin could still not eat in a restaurant, couldn't shop in a department store, couldn't go to the cinema, couldn't send their children to the best public school available, are denied the right to go to university, in a time when people of coloured race still couldn't vote in their local elections. A time when your access to full constitutional rights was based on the colour of your skin. A time when a child of coloured descent had half as much chance of getting through high school as their white counterparts, had a third of a chance of getting through college, a third of as much chance of becoming a professional, had half as much chance of owning a house, and suffered 4 times the chance of being unemployed. Had 1/7 the chance of earning over $10,000 a year, and a life expectancy 7 years shorter than white folk. A time when 17 million retirees over the age of 65 were barely surviving in abject poverty on a social security check of just $78 a month. Now, given the trouble, turbulence and strife that engulfs the nation in a cloud of fear and uncertainty, and blockaded by division and disagreement at every turn, try and imagine what you would do as the newly elected leader. How would you tackle the multiple problems on multiple fronts? How would you create a sense of unity and a need to work together in collaboration to break down the barriers of division that were crippling the country? What problem would you tackle first? And how would you go about it? How would you engage the hearts and minds of the country without alienating half the population? A situation where you're pretty much damned if you do and damned if you don't. And this is a situation that's actually not all that difficult to imagine, because in many respects, it's a similar situation to the one that confronts many of the world leaders of today. Yet these circumstances exactly describe the situation that confronted one of the world's past leaders. A leader that would go on to be remembered as one of the great world leaders of history. Why? It all revolved around what that leader did and how that leader tackled the situation. Against this backdrop of global and local division, disunity and crippling fear, he crafted a speech to the nation, a speech that would prove to be the starting point and turning point of a change in the mood and motivation of the entire country. Let me read an amended extract of this historic speech of the time, and put yourself in his shoes and see if you can guess who the leader is and when and where this speech was given. Let me begin. We meet at a college noted for knowledge, in a city noted for progress, in a state noted for strength, and we stand in need of all three. For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, despite the fact that this nation's own scientific manpower is doubling every 12 years in a rate of growth more than 3 times that of our population as a whole, despite that,
the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we've come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except that at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then, about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year, and then, less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if our country's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking space, and such a pace cannot help but create new wills as it dispels old. New ignorance, new problems, new dangers. Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it's not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer to rest, to wait. But this city, in this state, in this great country, was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay colony, said that all great and honourable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with unanswerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man, in his quest for knowledge and progress, is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in or not, and it's one of the great adventures of all time, and no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in the race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the industrial revolutions, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond, and we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. In short, our leadership in science and in industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men, and to become the world's leading spacefaring nation. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. and only if our country occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theatre of war. I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against the hostile misuse of space, any more than we go unprotected against the hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organise and measure the best of our energies and our skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one that we're unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. It is for these reasons that I regard the decision to shift our efforts in space from low to high gear as amongst the most important decisions that will be made during my incumbency. In the last 24 hours, we've seen facilities now being created for the greatest and most complex exploration in man's history. We have felt the ground shake and the air shattered by the testing of a Saturn C1 booster rocket, generating power equivalent to 10,000 automobiles with their accelerators on the floor. We have seen the site where the F1 rocket engines, each one as powerful as all 8 engines of the Saturn combined, will be clustered together to make the advanced Saturn missile, assembled in a new building to be built as tall as a 48-storey structure, as wide as a city block, and as long as 2 lengths of a football field. Within these last 19 months, at least 45 satellites have circled the Earth. Some 40 of them were made here, and they were far more sophisticated and supplied far more knowledge to the people of the world than those of the Soviet Union. The Mariner spacecraft, now on its way to Venus, is the most intricate instrument in the history of space science. The accuracy of that shot is comparable to firing a missile from Cape Canaveral and dropping it in this stadium between the 40-yard lines. Transit satellites are helping our ships at sea to steer a safer course. Tyros satellites have given us unprecedented warnings of hurricanes and storms, and will do the same for forest fires and icebergs. We have had our failures, but so have others, even if they don't admit them, and they may be less public. To be sure, we are behind, and will be behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade, we shall make up and move ahead. The growth of our science and education will be enriched by new knowledge of our universe and environment, by new techniques of learning and mapping and observation, by new tools and computers for industry, medicine, the home, as well as the school. Technical institutions will reap the harvest of these gains. And finally, the space effort itself, while still in its infancy, has already created a great number of new companies and tens of thousands of new jobs. Space and related industries are generating new demands in investment and skilled personnel, and this city and this state and this region will share greatly in this growth. What was once the furthest outpost of the old frontier of the West will be the furthest outpost on the new frontier of science and space. Your city, with its manned spacecraft centre, will become the heart of a large scientific and engineering community. During the next 5 years, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration expects to double the number of scientists and engineers in this area, to increase its outlays for salaries and expenses to $60 million a year, to invest some $200 million a year in plant and lab facilities, and to direct or contract for new space efforts over $1 billion from this centre in this city. To be sure, all this costs us a good deal of money. This year's space budget is 3 times what it was last year, and it's greater than the space budget of the previous 8 years combined. That budget now stands at $5.4 billion a year, a staggering sum, though somewhat less than we pay for cigarettes and cigars every year. Space expenditures will soon rise some more, from 40 cents per person per week to more than 50 cents a week for every man, woman and child in the country. For we have given this program a very high national priority, even though I realise that this is in some measure an act of faith and vision. For we do not know now what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that of the temperature of the sun, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first, before this decade is out, then we must be bold. I think we're going to do it. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in this decade. It may be done while some of you are still here at school at this college and university. It will be done during the term of office of some of the people who sit here on the platform. But it will be done. And it will be done before the end of this decade. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked, why did he want to climb it? He said, because it's there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you. How do you feel after listening to that? Inspired? Motivated? Positive? I don't know about you, but every time I listen to that, it gets my heart pumping, it raises the hairs on the back of my neck, and it lifts my spirits and gets my mind soaring. This talk changed the narrative of the time by creating a new unified vision that transcended all of the issues and challenges of the day and brought everyone together with the hope of a brighter tomorrow and the courage to work together to make the change and commit to a vision that was bigger and more important than any immediate issues and conflicts. It lifted the sights of everyone from their individual battles to a collective, all-encompassing and challenging goal that would move the entire world forward in the spirit of pioneering adventure and discovery. That excites us all at some deep visceral level and is one of the driving passions and reasons why the human race has been able to overcome so much and to achieve so much. This, of course, was President John F. Kennedy's or JFK's famous moonshot speech, which he delivered in September of 1962. And while he didn't live long enough to witness a fulfilment of this bold and daring vision, due to his unexpected assassination just over 12 months later, what's truly inspiring is that the strength and momentum of his vision lived on without him. And man did walk on the moon within the decade. When Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon and uttered the immortal words that we all remember, that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. And by uniting families, states, countries and the world via this challenging and spellbinding vision, the spirit of cooperation that emerged from this gargantuan effort also broke down the barriers to the issues of the day. And the flow-on effect and legacy of this vision saw the economy improve. The resulting Civil Rights Act ensured equal rights and opportunities for all Americans of any and all colour and race. He negotiated a treaty to end atmospheric nuclear testing, which was the first nuclear weapons treaty in history. And he reduced the threat of nuclear war by opening the lines of communication with Moscow and offering to help make the world safe for diversity. And all of this was started by this speech that used the power of story and a motivating challenge to reframe the collective narrative of the time. This is the power of story in motion, of using the power of words and meaning and changing the prevailing narrative in our individual and collective minds to transform our thinking, that transforms our actions, that combine to transform the world. In just 18 minutes, JFK successfully reframed an inspiring vision of a bright future that united the nation and the world on a much greater quest, that lifted their sights above petty divisions to a much greater cause. An ambitious cause encompassed in an exciting vision that was linked to long-term goals with a deadline. So what's your moonshot? What unifying vision and great challenge are you setting yourself, your family, your work colleagues and your community to overcome our issues and make the world a better place? Because overcoming challenges fuses courage and creates hope, self-belief and collective unity, a spirit of working together to achieve great things. An approach that is more in need around the world now than it's ever been, with the multiple threats on multiple fronts that we are confronted with each and every day in a world of constant, unpredictable uncertainty and dynamic change. A world in desperate need of visionary, collaborative, creative and unifying leadership at all levels, based on the power of crafting and embracing new and better visionary stories. So what's your moonshot? The power of story and creation of unifying visions is the driving passion and life story of today's special guest. So to touch on this, and to arm us with the tools that we need to better navigate a world in continuous turmoil, there's no better person to equip us than Tommy Deuschle. Tommy has spent his life creating opportunity out of adversity, after learning how to survive and thrive in the troubled and torn country of Zimbabwe. For over 15 years, he's been architecting and orchestrating movements that catalyze innovation, social change, and tell stories of hope and transformation. Tommy is widely sought after for his creative leadership and a rare ability to inspire vision, clarity, and courage among leaders and organisations. He's highly regarded as a transformational impact influencer, and his work with leaders across Africa, Europe, and the United Nations on igniting the power of story through film and music, startups, businesses, churches and movements in cities and across nations. He's produced multiple TV shows and media projects in Africa that have accumulated audiences of millions, and he's currently the executive producer of a Hollywood-based feature film. And the fuel for Tommy's fire emanates from his strong, unwavering faith. Tommy's a pastor at Celebration, Zimbabwe's largest multiracial church, with over 10,000 people gathering weekly in more than 130 locations. He also founded Stadium Worship, a movement that has united churches in Zimbabwe with a media audience of more than 4 million and events attended by 15,000 or more people. In today's refreshing discussion, Tommy answers all of your questions on how to learn and overcome adversity and use the power of creating new stories and inspiring visions in your life, including what are the key lessons from living with adversity, how can the power of story transform our lives, how important is hope in difficult times, how do we restore hope and belief in a world consumed with fear and hopelessness, how important is creativity to your future, and how are you able to be creative in stressful situations? How do we lift our sights from immediate reactive short-term interest to long-term generational infinite approaches? How do we individually and collectively restore trust in ourselves and others as a basis for unity and harmony? What part does a common unified vision and values play in our future, and how do we achieve it? We touch on how important humility is to our collective future and how we can reinstill it. He gives his thoughts on what's the most powerful, enduring legacy that you can create. And Tommy downloads some immediately usable innovations with the use of imagine statements, creative trust rooms, the transformational power of music, and the need to plan adventures. And in the spirit of open collaborative creativity to make our world a better place, the synergy of our conversation today has actually sparked the beginning of a new movement, the Anonymous Generosity Movement. So listen out for what this means, what it means to you, and how you and everyone you know can start doing little daily invisible things that will have a massive positive impact on the world at large. So watch this space, as Tommy has helped me unleash an invisible force of rippling continuous improvement here. Now, while we're talking about improvement, keep an ear out for upcoming changes in the format of Get Invested in coming weeks, because based on your feedback, we'll be shifting the emphasis and structure of upcoming episodes. Instead of each episode containing a long content intro by me prior to the guest conversation, which many listeners have seen as distracting and confusing, we're going to trial mixing it up so that the monthly Get Invested schedule contains 3 guest conversation episodes with a quick guest intro, pinpointing the highlights and what answers you get from the discussion. And the 4th weekly episode will be a long-form deep dive discussion, or what I call a bush soliloquy, from me, myself and I, on lifestyle and investment topics of your interest. So if you have a burning topic that you'd like me to explore in these monthly drill downs, feel free to email me on bushy@knowhowproperty.com.au with your suggestions. And also make sure you give us the good, the bad and the downright ugly on the new format, to ensure that we're giving you good, engaging information in a style that adds value to your life today. So let me close by challenging you again. What's your moonshot? To inspire you to imagine and create your answer to this, my discussion with Tommy Deuschle is a really interesting, inspiring and thought-provoking conversation where you're going to learn some fantastic new approaches and takeaways that will reframe your internal stories and your life vision as the start of greater things. So please enjoy Tommy Deuschle. Hi, Freedom Fighters. Now, as the world continues to suffer unprecedented levels of adversity and uncertainty from the ongoing series of quite unexpected rolling punches that are being delivered by the contagion, I thought it timely to talk with a global entrepreneurial leader from Zimbabwe who's grown up in a sea of constant adversity and continued to not only survive but to thrive in relentless, unpredictable circumstances. So welcome, and let's get invested, Tommy Deuschle. How are you, Tommy?
That's it. This is great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, we're both good mates of a common friend in Andrew Montesi, who's been a guest on Get Invested in the past, and I know you're spending a bit of time with him over there in the States at the moment. How's life in Reading?
Reading is such a peculiar place because you have Montesi here for one, but then you've got this global kind of melting pot of people living in this small town of 80,000 people, just because it seems to attract people with vision. which is very incredible for a small town in the US.
Love it. Well, we're going to come back to that vision topic during our discussion today. But, mate, for the listeners who don't know you and who you are, can we start by getting you to give us a rundown on who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do?
Yes, definitely. So I am from Zimbabwe. I run a creative agency called Vana Media and a ministry called Kingdom Nation, which helps connect different churches together to do something collective for the city that they're in. And then I also am a pastor back in Zimbabwe, where my dad, who's the founding pastor of a church, has 130 churches in Southern Africa. And so that's what I do. I would say that everything that I'm involved in focuses on the power of story. Because I believe in the power of story, and the reason I believe in the power of story, I've seen how it has shaped different people in a nation that has experienced really global setback and in some cases economic collapses. And so I've seen the power of stories in the midst of fear. I've seen the power of story in the midst of victory. And my goal is to help share the best stories to the world, because we can always do with a better story. And so anything I do involves that. I don't know if that answers enough of the question, but
yeah, it does, mate. And again, you've touched on a subject that we'll come back and do a deep dive into shortly in relation to those stories and how you see story being so fundamental to setting the scene for individual and collective outlook. But, mate, before we do that, I'd love you to sort of share your own story in terms of your family's journey and go back as far as you would like and are comfortable with, and talk us through where you've invested your time, your interest, your energy and your money. Where has it got you to? What have you learned from it? And how has it brought you to where you are today?
All right, so I'll start, and thanks for that question, Bushy. I'll start where kind of my dad changed the trajectory of our family, because so many people, have these opportunities, even amongst COVID, right, where you have to make these big decisions. What do we do? What's next? And so in the 1979, my dad moved from the US to Zimbabwe during a civil war, and started a small church with 6 people in his living room, a guitar, a really bad voice, and he would tell you that. He had a bad voice and he tried to sing, but wasn't really that good. And just had a goal to serve the people of Zimbabwe and to see their gifts come to their full potential and to see a nation thrive. And so he made that decision during the war, and then, my brothers and I were born in Harare, Zimbabwe, and grew up doing so many different things, right? So we went to the local school there. We never went to international schools there. We grew up as local Zimbabweans, hence my accent. And it was really about, our whole family was about, how do we see people come to the fullness of what they were created to do? That was our entire goal. And so we did it in the church context. And I saw a few things in church context, and some people would call it the NGO world, where NGOs sometimes have this bad rap of putting Band-Aids on bleeding arteries, right? So Are we really doing anything? Are we just giving shoes to kids on the street and food to families only for them to eat the food and lose their shoes down by the river where a crocodile takes them? What's the bigger goal here? And I think our family's motto was building people, building dreams to see a new kind of kingdom built. And so we always, around the dinner table, always had conversations about what if, possibilities. And I saw in that the power of 2 different stories. One story driven by fear and another story driven by love. And what I mean by that is, growing up in Zimbabwe, we had 3 different economic collapses. We've been declared a failed nation by the United Nations. And if you were to ask a lot of Zimbabweans, in the past 10 years, what your goal in life is, they would tell you their goal in life is to leave Zimbabwe. So how do you build, how do you have success, and how do you have a fun trajectory where the goal is just to leave? Like, you can't build that way. But we saw the preservation of story, and our conversations around the dinner table were always, what if, imagine this, what if we embrace the small things we had to do something powerful? And so with that in mind, we would start to focus on the powerful things that were in front of us. And from that, I started a media company called C Media Africa, and we started to reshape the narrative of these struggling companies and entrepreneurs within the nation, because we always felt like there was a better story to tell, right? And often your reality is the story you tell yourself. And so we would sit with these CEOs and bring the most powerful, innovative media solutions to say, hey, I know things are tough. I know sometimes you want to go home and hide under your bed and, find 5 ice creams to eat and just, go to sleep. But actually, there's a way to view this differently. And so we would sit with these CEOs, and they would hand us a bunch of their problems. They would hand us a bunch of kind of their vision that they thought was dead. And they would say, we don't know where we're going right now. And so our team would sit in a room. We called it the creative trust room, where we would throw different ideas around and come back and present a new story to these CEOs and leaders of companies. And they would say, that's exactly what's on our heart. You've given us hope again, and this is what we want to do. And so I saw the power of story give vision back to people. Number 2, I saw this power of story give hope to people. And number 3, I saw the power of story, actually get investment where it seemed like investment was impossible, and all kinds of investment, relationship investment, capital investment. And and one of the things that where I spend a lot of my time is relationships. Someone once told me that people don't invest in projects, they invest in people. And so I've spent a lot of my life in whatever I do really getting to know people, because once you get to know their gifts and the value of who they are, whether you're in a failed nation, a COVID-driven world, you start going, man, I can imagine what could potentially happen if we were to do something together where you were able to thrive. And so in anything I've ever done investment-wise or capital-wise, I always come back to, am I investing in people? Because at the end of the day, that's going to be the richest thing in the world, is when we have a richness of relationship.
Totally agree. And mate, you've shared with us some absolute gold in what you've outlined so far. And I'd like to dig into some of that a bit if I can. And I want to go right back to your good father and parents, because what I'm hearing from what you're talking about is there's a level of courage and fearlessness that can only be really built around, a very strong faith that would even allow him to say, right, it's a good idea to jump on a plane and go into a war-torn country and try and rebuild the people to build the country. Can you remember back, what it was about your parents that led them to believe that mission was what they needed to do in the world?
Yes, it was very clear, and at least to my dad, right? I wasn't born, but he was actually studying to become a Catholic leader in the church and had an encounter with Jesus, and really kind of bizarre, because he was kind of I'm trying to respect him because he's an incredible man, but he would tell you in his own words, he was just kind of visionless, and he felt like God talked to him and say, move to Rhodesia, and he thought that was off the coast of Rhode Island on the east coast of the US. And so when he said yes, and he says he doesn't hear God all the time audibly, but he really felt like it was a call to something a lot bigger than himself. And when he said yes, he didn't know that it was in the heart of Africa. And so that started his fearless journey of, I'm going to live beyond my current situation, and I'm going to have a core belief in something that's bigger than me. The one thing that I did feel like he lived out, the two things actually that I feel like he did live out in front of us well was vision is about people, not about strategy or projects. And so what I mean by that is that it felt like his heart was connected to a people group before it was connected to a big company or a big organization to build. And so that's what keeps you going is who am I called to first? Then what am I called to? Because if we can be called to people, then that, again, it's that richness piece. And then the second thing is he taught us not to fear. And I think it's very easy to teach fear, and we're actually born with two fears. We're only ever born with two fears. One is the fear of loud noises, and the second fear we're born with is the fear of falling, because as babies, you start to kind of figure that out. But every other fear is actually learned. We get taught to fear. And I'm like, man, my parents did a good job at teaching us not to fear. And they didn't react when crazy things would happen. They didn't react when, we had an economic collapse or we had a dictator that made bad decisions. It was always a response. What could potentially come out of this? And I think that's what makes great leaders great, is instead of reacting to fear and making that the teacher, how about we look through this with a different lens and say, what could the possibilities be in this? And I think that's kind of what philosophy my dad had.
Yeah, I love it. And it clearly it's because it's almost become intuitive in you to be always looking at the positive side or the opportunity side of whatever circumstance that you're in, and that's underpinned by a unrelenting faith which creates hope. Then
yes,
all of a sudden the short-term immediate fears don't amount to fears, that because you are looking at it through very different glasses from a lot of other people in the world. Mate, just sort of expanding on that a little bit then, because I'd love, you sort of mentioned the creative trust room. I love that. Can you sort of put a little bit more colour around, what that was about, how that worked? Because I just think as a means of creating a creative environment, just designating a space that's probably without boundaries or bias is a start towards reframing how you're looking at situations. Can you give us a little bit more colour around that one?
Yes, definitely. And Bushy, I think you and I have incredible philosophy on this, even from a songwriting music perspective. And I think the reason why we set that up in our creative agency was because when I first started getting team members onto the creative agency team, whether it was editors or designers or directors of photography, a lot of these guys actually weren't trained formally. And so we all kind of were this sort of random cosmopolitan group of toughs that just sort of looked at each other like, all right, let's just see if we can make something happen. And I realized quickly how fearful people were to bring their idea to the table. And it was like, I was like, this has to be crushed in order for us to really get the gold. We got to be willing to get through the dirt, and the dirt is the bad ideas. And so we had a few philosophies of how we ran that room. And number one, we definitely had. I'm gonna list a few, and I'm gonna miss a lot. But we had to have coffee in the room, right? So like, it just had to happen. Without it just didn't work. So we had to have that. We had a really great atmosphere. And then we had a few rules of how we did stuff. So we had this thing called, and we might have gotten it from the way Pixar ran stuff, but we ended up adopting it ourselves.
Yep.
But it was this: no idea is a bad idea. And in fact, if you give a bad idea, you get rewarded. Like you actually get clout. You're like, that was a bad idea. Well done.
Love it.
And so you actually took away the fear of what if I come up with a bad idea by saying we celebrate bad ideas. And the philosophy behind that was if you give a bad idea to a great team, that bad idea becomes great. If you give a great idea to a bad team or a fearful team, that great idea becomes nothing. And so it's like, how do we allow everyone in the room to feel like they can participate in shaping the best ideas to come to the table? So there was that, and then there was no negative comments. And so you'll be surprised when you take negativity out of the equation, how much hope and how much vision can come into a room. And then we had another, we had a bunch, so I'm just listing a few of them.
Yeah, it's good.
But we had another one which was, what was it? It was every idea can get better. So no matter what good thing we came up with, it was how do we make it better? So a lot of people do something and then they go, that was great. We kept on pushing. Okay, but how do we make it just a little bit better? What do we need to do to make it just a little bit better? And so even today, like I'll have my team from around the world call me and say, man, we miss those times we were in the same space. I've taken those and I'm doing them with, other teams that we're building out. And it just became a really powerful culture where negativity wasn't in the room, fear of bad ideas wasn't in the room, and everyone felt like they could contribute.
Yeah, I love that, mate. You had me at coffee. Tell me.
Yes, there we go. Bushy, I don't know. Some people have said, well, what about tea? And I'm like, no, you need to go into another podcast or another, move on from here.
I love it. Mate, you touched on our common love of music, and I'd love to expand on that as well, because in terms of a storytelling device, I don't think there's any greater vehicle than music to emotionally engage the heart and the soul. And would love you to share with us how and why music has become a part of your life, and where you see music fitting in relation to not just the pure joy of creating and performing music, but its potential as a tool.
So I started writing songs when I was about 8 years old, and Bushy, I don't know, what's your favorite song, Bushy? Is there one that you're like, no matter when this comes on, like it changes my day or it changes my mood? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Oh, I've got a bunch, mate. Probably too many to remember, because I music generally lifts my spirits. So could I classify one? I'll come back to you on that, mate. I'll let the old grey circles do some cool crunching. But yeah, there's a bunch of them. Yeah,
well, so I'm very similar to you, and it just sets the tone and the mood. And so even when we create film projects, I'm working on a film right now, and a huge piece of this is the music. And I would go on record to say that I think more than half percentage of film is music, and that's me. Yeah. So I'm a music producer with my brother. He's worked in Hans Zimmer Studios before with some of his colleagues, and so we've created music together. And I think besides the emotive part to it, I believe that music shapes the culture of nations. And so and there's a guy called Andrew Fleming, I think he was one of the leaders of Depeche Mode, and he was quoting a philosopher, and basically the statement went like this: don't tell me about the government who's leading a nation. Tell me who's writing the songs of a nation, and I'll tell you the direction of where that nation is going.
Yeah, I love it.
And I think that, and I was talking with someone who is a kids, he creates content for kids, and he said, here's the thing. He said, if you want to teach theology, and he was in obviously a church setting, he said, if you want to teach theology to kids, put them into a song.
Yeah.
Because the songs will teach the values and the theology for the next generation. So for me, I think the power of that, like you said, you can have a message, but you put it into a song, and then it becomes part of your rhythm as opposed to part of your mindset. So I think rhythm is so powerful. If something can become part of my rhythm in life, then that's so much more important than a written document or a principle, 1, 2, 3 principles.
Yeah, it's spot on, mate. Because it what I find about music, it actually smashes through the intellectual side of us that wants to filter everything, and
yes,
because it's appealing to the heart and the soul, it gets right into our bones. There's just, and as you say, if you've got music in your soul, you just can't help but move to it. It has has this flow and motion that the brain can't control. We'll find. I don't know about you, but as soon as music comes on, I start to move. I cannot help move. When
correct,
it doesn't matter what sort of music it is. My fingers are tapping, or I'm starting to sway because it's resonating.
So good, so good, and it resonates no matter what message it's bringing. Like, I mean, because if you play horror music and you're sitting around flowers and a waterfall and someone selling popsicles, it's still weird. Like you'll see the popsicles as like things that might transform into aliens. You'll see the flowers as suspicious. So like the music sets the tone for the picture. And if you play powerful music and you have a hope-filled song, you can be in the crashing economy or a COVID world, and you will look at that picture differently than you would if you'd had no music.
100%. In fact, I often find myself, I don't know about you, Tommy, but if I'm feeling a little bit frustrated or whatnot, then I'll often go straight to music to shift my mood.
Yes.
And in fact, one of the routines that my good wife Sonia and I often do is we'll just dance around the kitchen. If we want to get the day off to a really great energetic start, we'll throw on some of our favourite tracks and we'll just literally dance around the kitchen for 5 or 10 minutes to set the tone for the day.
Now that's a great piece of advice. I'm going to try that with my wife tonight and see what she says. Although she's not a dancer, I'll give it a bash.
Anyone can dance if they don't feel like they're dancing, mate. That's.
Hey, I might have been born in Africa, but I'm a proper white boy when it comes to that.
Well, just slow dance. Do the 3-minute slow dance, mate.
There we go. I can do that.
Yeah, you can't miss. Mate, I'd love you to sort of, again, in the context of the world that we're currently in, and let's face it, in a lot of parts of the Western world, we've had it very comfortable for too long. So any form of adversity, I think, is exaggerated at times. And, in our own country, where we went into lockdown, being locked down and not being able to go to work and being forced to watch Netflix isn't exactly a big imposition, I don't believe, in terms of the comparative stuff that people have had to live with. And in your own case, the constant challenges you would have had in Zimbabwe. Can you share with us a little bit more of the story in Zimbabwe so that the people really understand what you were contending with day to day and what impact that had on you, and given that fearless approach that's been instilled by your parents, some of the situations that you found yourself in and how that different approaches help you to work through that?
Yeah, so I'll give a few examples, and I normally talk about 3 just because I feel like 3 is easy to remember. But 3 things to kind of paint the picture of where Zimbabwe was at during, and still is kind of at. But one is that the statistic of unemployment is 90%. So 90% of our people are unemployed.
Wow.
On paper. Now there's a black market that figures itself out. But the second thing is that we've been declared a failed nation 3 different times and actually lost our currency. So What that kind of looks like is you put money in the bank, you've been saving, you've been doing really diligently because you were told to do that in grade 3, and you've stuck with that your entire life. And then, one day you wake up and your actual cash is coupons from just coupons, and you can only spend it within a certain place, that being in Zim. So it's like sometimes it felt like diligence didn't pay off. It felt like everyone was surviving and trying to find ways to make money. And then probably one of the hardest things was just that started to just embrace or at least promote a lack culture, which is like, okay, there's not enough. And that was very difficult, because if ever you've had disappointment in your life, it's a tough thing. Proverb says that hope deferred makes the heart sick. And so Zimbabweans have had their hope deferred multiple times, where there's been a new president and everyone thinks this is going to be incredible. We're going to be liberated again from our economic woes. And then that president ends up becoming statistically worse than the previous dictator. And people start going, how much more of this can I take? And so you're surrounded by unemployment, you're surrounded by need. And people just, and then you start to almost feel guilty for having anything. So it's a really hard battle to face. And then obviously when you hear people in the US, and I had friends in the US say that their biggest challenge was that their car payment went up by $5. It's a really tough thing to still love it, because you're like, so
come on, let's get a grip, shall we? Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I think you touch on. Sorry, mate, go on.
No. Sorry, just because it might help, just in terms of where we're at now. But it's hard to not have a victim mindset in that place, because woe is me. Like, I am in a bad position.
Yeah.
And then that becomes very self-centered, because and that's a tough thing to deal with. And it's hard not to feel that way, especially when, we're in COVID, especially when you feel like, man, it's my problems and my issues. And that's what we were surrounded by.
Constantly, and we're talking generational here. We're not talking 12 months. We're talking generations of false hope.
Correct.
So, I mean, yourself and your family would have been like sparks in the darkness in terms of reinstilling hope as a believable hope. This is the thing. When you've had years and years of false promises, false hope, then that sense of hopelessness, I'm sure, would be a thick crust that would be hard to break through. You mentioned how, in your media work in Zimbabwe, you've helped to reshape the narrative in people's minds to reframe that. Can you give us a couple of examples of that? Because I agree with you. But one of the most powerful words I think we have in the English language is imagine. Because you've only got to mention that word, and immediately your brain starts to, or in my case, think of possibility. So I'd love you to again share some of the individual stories around where you've gone in and what was the narrative, and what narrative did you create to create a better story that then created that vision, which then creates hope and belief, and then that also creates a sense of unity in terms of that unified direction that a group is going in. Can you share some of that with us and some of the examples that you've had on that journey?
That's a great question, and I really, it's hard to just come back and say, we were strategic in this way, because I think it was honestly, at the time, you're like on your knees going, how do we actually help the scenario, the situation? But what we started realizing is that hope had to be something more than our surroundings. It had to be based on something that was more than our situation. And so in the context of why us and probably a lot of our community members were sparks of light was because we have a hope that doesn't disappoint. In Romans, it says that in Scripture, which is what we really anchored our faith on, that there's a hope that doesn't disappoint. And so we would come into a conversation with a CEO or starting a TV show that we would produce and say, right, what's the real story here, right? Because there's always lenses on a story, just like music. So people would come and say, look, the reality is that we are down on our numbers. We're really struggling. We've had to let go of people. And those are the facts. But what we found is that the facts weren't necessarily the story of the imagined statement. So we have this thing which I help CEOs with is, what's your imagined statement? Not what's your vision statement. What's your imagined statement? Because everyone can have these vision statements and slap on a wall. But when you have an imagined statement, that evokes this emotion. And so we would help carve these imagined statements in the form of a campaign. And we never lied, because I think it's false hope lies. False hope says it ignores the facts. What we do is we focus on the facts that have the richness that are the richness that are attached to them. And so we took the specific company. They were they were an international company, one of the biggest in agriculture, and they said, look, we're really struggling. And we came and focused on the goodness of the history. We focused on the power of their people. We focused on what could potentially happen if they were able to do everything they were supposed to do. We focused on the power of their partnerships. We focused on the fact that they were still there and they were persevering. All those things were true. And so we shifted the lens from this is bad facts to these are the powerful, rich pieces that still exist even in the mess. And I think that's what a lot of CEOs and leaders would come to us and say, you guys tell hope stories. They're not false stories, they're hope stories, because we changed the lens.
Mate, very powerful imagine statements. I've never heard anyone frame that before. And what a powerful mechanism to really get the creative juices flowing. That's a really good tool that I'm going to take that, mate. Tommy, I've just adopted that one. Oh, yeah, take it. So
definitely. And actually, one of the things we do is a story guide session with CEOs and leaders and actually create an entire story that's mapped out for them. And we start with their imagined statement. And it's amazing the different kind of strategy that comes from that.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's you're no longer thinking about the difficulties of today. You're thinking about a much brighter tomorrow, and the boundaries and the constriction tends to drop away, and the negative thinking, as you've already mentioned, also drops away. And if you encapsulate that in a creative trust room, where one of the rules is that you're not going to make negative statements or use negative talk, then suddenly you've created a positive catalyst to start shifting the energy. Mate, brilliant tools there, mate. Absolutely brilliant tools. Mate, I'd like to start applying this now to, and we've touched on this already, but most parts of the world are still being affected in some way or another, and others a lot worse than others in relation to the impact that the contagions had. And we've already touched on reframing, change as opportunity rather than sort of reacting to the unknown. What else do you think that, from your background and history, that we can take in terms of approaching our current situations differently, both on an individual and on a collective level?
That's a good question, and it's, I'm going to come back to what I always feel like people are looking for, and what I've seen the most success on, is creating a culture where people's gifts thrive. Because of there's two things happen in isolation, and you talked about unity at the beginning of our conversation, and unity has to be found in belonging, not in just a destination. It's got to be, we actually feel like we belong and thrive together, as opposed to we should be unified.
Yeah.
And you unite on two things. You unite on chaos, which is a bad uniter because it's not strong.
The common enemy. Yep.
Exactly, which the common enemy. Or you unite on vision, imagine. And when you unite on vision, that becomes so powerful because you start to leverage the gifts, the different gifts in people. And I actually did a study on why people join gangs. And the reason they join gangs, guys who grew up in normal Christian homes or, pretty well morally based homes. And they were like, well, we just wanted a place and a group to belong to. And I think Mother Teresa said this. She said, look, and I think it still applies today. She said she's traveled the entire world and she's dealt with so many sicknesses and diseases. And the number one sickness she's discovered is the sickness of loneliness.
Yeah.
And she said, so we live in this isolated, lonely world. And I would say, if whatever team, whatever leadership, whatever community that you're in, the stories you create, the company, the services and products that you do, if we can thrive if we can have a goal of creating belonging where people can thrive and their gifts can thrive, then you're building something that's investing in people. You're building something that's going to last a lot longer than you, as opposed to just being staunch driven towards a singular dream. I think it's good. I think it's important. But I do think that I've seen many people become super self-focused about what they're supposed to do, and they actually miss a bigger component of the richness of the people around them.
I totally agree. 100% agree with you on that score. Just sort of expanding on that subject a little bit again, because I think Zimbabwe would provide lots of examples of this, which I hope you can share. But what I often find is competing visions. And let's face it, for better or worse, we live in a world with that self-focus and the ego can often become dominant, so that it's all about me, and with very little humility, which I'll come back to in a minute as well. But can you describe a situation that you've been in Zimbabwe where you've got disparate groups coming together, whether it be race, whether it be faith, whether it be belief, or and talk us through how you may have managed, given the approach your family has adopted, to break down some of those barriers and bring what would otherwise be potential conflict to a point of unified direction and connection.
Yeah, so I've got two examples, and maybe you could help me which one to chat about. But one was when we helped unite and get different people from the community right off the streets all the way to guys who had investment banks in one room to share ideas where they would normally never come in one room. The other one was when there was about 200 different church and religious organizations that previously hadn't really worked together, came together to create a collective media campaign and a kind of a vision for the city through a media campaign and an event.
I reckon they're both good examples, mate. So you're not going to get out of this easily. I'm going to get you to run through both of them. It's because I think both are very different, but the first one has a more corporate feel about what we do. Well, no, it doesn't, because it's embracing all spheres from what you're saying. The other could be more. The second could be more challenging because while they're all churches, the finite hair-splitting difference in doctrine can create major roadblocks to actually getting people to move forward together. So do you mind expanding on both of those? I think there's some good learnings in both of those, mate.
Oh, I'd be happy to. And so the first one, and all of this was done with incredible teams, by the way, where we would get together and say, hey, the first example was there's not enough people supporting each other's ideas, and there's not a culture of generosity. In fact, there's a culture of fear.
Yeah.
And so we said, okay, cool, we're going to make this very simple. And we started something called pitch nights, which was an hour every month. 2 hours every month in this cool retro basement where we gave away free coffees and water and had pumping music. And so you'd walk down there, you'd kind of feel like you're a bit in a club, but then also kind of the corporate setting too. So we attracted doctors and bankers and people who were making stuff in their back garage who couldn't afford to like repair their shoes. And all these people were coming under one roof and from different religious organizations. And at first they kind of looked at us, Bushy, and they were like, okay, so what is this place? Like everyone was kind of skeptical. But because we played good music, people sort of were hopeful anyway.
Yeah.
See what I did there?
Yeah.
And so everyone came into the room like positive. And at first we started, I had 3 people get up that night and share their idea for the city, whether it was a business idea or a technology idea or a community idea. And they would run through some slides. We had some training on it too so that it wasn't boring. And then after that, we created what was called a community springboard. Now, what the community springboard was 7 minutes where the community would raise their hands and contribute either encouragement, finance, connections, relationships, even purchase orders in some cases. And so what you would have is this person putting themselves on the stage vulnerable. And we said, look, you can ask questions, you can contribute, but you cannot tear down. And so you'd have this person sitting on stage with this group of people. And the first night we packed it and it just kept on getting packed. We found sponsors to sponsor it and then we turned it into a TV show. But I'll come back to how it began was people initially were going to steal my ideas. We're afraid of things not going right. We don't trust anyone. And after a few different times of pitch night gatherings, the narrative started to change. Now it was, this feels like family. We cannot wait to support someone else's idea. We feel like we belong. And so that was a perfect example of turning the narrative, putting a different lens on it, going, man, everyone's trying to screw each other. This is tough. It's a bad environment. People are stealing ideas because back then we had a lot of ideas stolen. Well, we shifted that narrative and really just saw a powerful news story come from that. And then we actually still have pitch nights happening in a city called Bulawayo, and that's where it moved to, and it's still happening today.
Love it. Well, I mean, what you've actually done there is created a community. You've created the connection that the relationship connection. You said very early in our discussion how important relationships is. And I'm with you. People get sick of me saying, in our business, we're not in the property business, we're not in the finance business, we're in the relationship business.
Yes,
because that's and what you've very well done in a very positive, neutral, safe environment is to break down those barriers and started creating relationships. Mate, you've touched on trust there. This is something that, I guess one of my concerns that I see emerging from this isolation and the separatism that the isolation is creating is the potential for, we already live in a trust vacuum when it comes to world leadership, in my opinion, and a lot of times well justified. In that environment that you're talking about, and I can imagine there would have been a lot of distrust, given the state that the place is in. People were being very guarded. Were there any specific things that you did there to start increasing the sense of trust amongst the group?
I don't know if we did anything specifically in that group, but what we did was we allowed people to ask questions, which I think, gave room for there to be a kind of a trust feeling. So, for example, one of the things I give any team that I work with is a picture of gaps. I say, look, no matter what, in any relationship, whether it's with your wife, or your kids or your partner, there's always going to be gaps in the relationship. For example, my wife's at home right now, and she's probably on her phone texting someone. I don't know who that is, but if I don't know, there's a gap, right?
Yeah.
And so I either choose to put trust in that gap, or suspicion can start to come into that gap. And so what we started to have as a culture was, if you're remotely about to put suspicion into a gap, go ahead and flag it and raise it so we can put trust into the gap instead. And so it allowed this incredible conversation where guys would now come to you and say, hey, can I just fill the gap with trust? Can I, I'm about to fill this with suspicion. Can I ask a question so I can fill this gap with trust? And it just changed the conversation. It was like, we now have language to fighting for something that's so important, where before it was like, well, I don't know, I have a gap, and then suspicion gradually creeps in there, and then once suspicion's in there, it's like poison. It's really hard to do anything positive.
Mate, but what I'm loving about what I'm hearing is that you're creating very subtle but significant tools, and it can be as simple as what you've just said, but with profound influence on the harmony in the group, by giving them a mechanism that says, if you're feeling this way, this is how we're going to deal with it. So rules is probably too hard a word, but you've created a set of operating tools which create habits. Because if you're starting to adopt those tools, that creates a habit that then sets the scene for the behaviour of the group ongoing.
Yep.
Absolutely brilliant, mate. I love I think the genius is in simplicity, and I love the way you seem to have this innate ability to come up with what appears to be simple tools that can be applied to a situation that has very profound results, mate. So I take my hat off to you in that regard, mate. Mate, sort of flowing through from there, I'd also like to sort of touch on the subject of short-term versus long-term thinking, because again, one of the things that concerns me in some aspects in certain areas is the propensity for everything to be based on the here and now, which creates a very reactive, self-centered sort of approach, versus the sort of long-term generational, sort of infinite approaches to life that we see in some cultures, and Japanese culture being an example of that. Can you talk to us about your views on that, and in the circumstances that you've operated, either in Zimbabwe or others, where you've tended to shift the mood from the short termism to a longer term outlook?
Well, I think, Bushy, even our decision as a family to come to Reading for a season was part of that. In terms of part of our process of walking that out,
Yep.
It's easy to hold on to something that you've been doing your whole life and going, it's that same one. In fact, I hate the fact that I'm going to say it, but I'm going to say it. If you do the same, if you do the same thing again and you expect different results, you're the one that's crazy, or something to the tune of that. But it's like, I think when you start thinking of your life living beyond you, and then what am I going to be passing on to the next generation? And I think once you start having that conversation with your family. And I did something with my wife called the Patterson Life Plan, which the guy that helped create Disney's strategy and kind of really story for big companies, including NASA, he designed something called the Patterson Life Plan for people. He said, look, if big companies can do this, people should do this.
Yeah.
And so we sat and literally for 2 days straight started to plan some of these things. And one of the questions they asked was, what are people going to say about you when you turn 50? What is the biggest things people are going to say about you? And these are kind of like these imagined statements. And you start going, actually, when you think about the effect your life has on other people and then your sons and daughters, then you start going, hang on a moment, is what I'm doing today going to match that?
Yeah.
And so I think everyone gets to a place where they're challenged to think about what they're passing on, not just what they're going to achieve.
Yeah, love that. Absolutely love that, mate. It's and I think it's for those that have children, it's something they're more likely to think about because there is a generation that you're passing it to. Increasingly, we're living in a world where there are a lot of partners who don't have kids, and therefore there's a tendency for that selfishness to permeate because there's no perceived need to think beyond self. Mate, applying that to leadership, because we've talked about the fact that what I'm seeing, and I think to some degree exacerbated by social media, given the algorithms that tend to allow you to see more of what you believe in and less of what you don't.
Oh yeah,
and the recent result in the US election is a classic case of the United States really being the divided states. And it sort of goes with a lack of leadership and the crisis of trust that's developing there. Given that you're currently living and breathing in the States, what's your feelings around the hope for leadership and the style and approach of leadership that needs to be adopted in not only the States but in the UK and other parts of the world, where this macho ego, almost dictatorial approach to life seems to have been emerging in some parts of the world. What's your views on all of that?
I come back to the greatest leader that I think of in history, which is Jesus, and I take the Bible as a complete guide, not only belief system but the truth. And so when I look at what Jesus did, even strategically, and the words that he said, which was the greatest leader will be the greatest servant.
Yeah.
I don't think you can veer too far off from that.
Yeah.
And so whether the world is saying one thing, you need to be macho, you need to be bullshit, you need to be bigoted, that to me falls secondary to the truth in my life, which is I'm going to go by someone who's proven. I'm going to go by someone that's shaped my world. And how do I be the best servant? And that's why I think you and I resonate so clearly, because since I've talked to you briefly just today and from what I've heard from Monty is, how do we serve the people? Because that is the richness of life.
Yeah.
And I think if we can keep holding on to that, then even if we impact 5 people with a true richness of serving as opposed to 1,000 people because we're loud on social media, I'd rather take the former. I'd rather take the former.
Every day of the week, mate. And I something that sort of underpins that, and again, the value that I respect the most and see the least in our world at the moment is humility. And all of the great leaders that I sort of gravitate to throughout history appear to have demonstrated an incredible humility, and it comes around that the richness of serving others. There's no question about it, because it's all about how can I help others, not how can I serve myself. what's your thoughts on the importance of humility, both individually and collective, and how do you think we can reinstill humility as an admirable and highly respected trait?
Wow, Bushy, that's putting me on the spot. I think I think humility is sort of like paying your taxes. You feel like everyone else should do it, but you don't want to. You take yourself out of it. But I think humility is tough because the gauge really is. I think the gauge is people who are closest to you, because I could think I'm walking in humility, and someone could pull me aside and be like, "Hey, your actions and your words and the way that you have lived this past week comes across really cocky." And I think we need people in our life to keep us in check, and to keep our motive in check. So it's I would say one of the biggest things is to keep yourself around people who are also level-headed. The company you keep is so key, and I think one of the hardest things in my life probably has been to block out the noise that screams promote yourself and just be about yourself. I'm not saying promoting yourself is wrong, but I think today we live in a very self-focused world that's screaming at us to become more self-focused. And so the key for me has been, how do I keep people around me that can say, "Hey, you're being an a-hole today"? How do I keep people around me saying, "Hey man, there's something more that you can ascribe to"? And I think, that would be if we need humility. It's 100% important. And I think the way that you keep the gauge on that is by keeping people around you that are honest.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things that I've learned from my awesome wife, Sonia, and it's something that she practices very regularly, is because it's taken us a long time to come to this, but we've recognised that true fulfilment in life comes from giving to others without ever expecting anything in return, but also giving without anyone knowing that you've done it.
Yes.
And you know, little things like I'll often see my wife, even in our cities here, that she'll see a homeless person. She'll go into a coffee shop and she'll say, "Can you? I'm going to pay for a coffee and a sandwich. Can you take that out to them?" And just so they've got something to eat today. And she disappears into the background. No one knows she's done it. The person, I've seen it. I've seen the eyes light up from the person who's enjoying it and is looking around for, well, okay, who's given me this gesture? But the sense of fulfillment that comes from that level of humility and making that as a regular practice, I think is something that I challenge the listeners to try it, because until you've done something like that without recognition, you probably don't realise just how, because there is almost some selfishness in it, in the respect that the level of gratification you get from helping others without them knowing it is second to none. And you've mentioned the greatest leader that impacted you. There's countless examples of where he's done exactly that, mate. So
that's so good. And just to hit on what you said, I think Sonia should write a book on it and call it the Anonymous Generosity Challenge. How much can you give without people knowing?
Love it, mate. We might talk more about that.
It's cool.
My wife is so humble that she would shun the limelight from that. But
that's why she needs to do it. We need more people like her.
That's right. Yeah, I love it. I love that, mate. Yeah, food for thought. I'm going to come back to you on that one. The Anonymous Generosity Project. I'm loving that. Mate. Something that I'd love to sort of bring it to a close on, almost, because we've talked about the power of imagination. Can you paint us a picture of what your ideal world and lifestyle is, and how that relates to whatever you define as sustainable success?
Yeah, so I mean, ideal world. I'll stay quite broad, but I think I think at the core of it, it's my family, both my immediate family and the people that I choose to call family, are thriving in a place where they belong, where they have the ability to dream and create together, where collaboration is second nature, and then where we're able to empower more and more people that have gifts that would normally not be empowered. I know that sounds really ambiguous, but I feel like everything works from a place of overflow. And so if your family is in a powerful position and there's integrity and honesty and connection, then you can only give what you have. And so I would love to create a creative, and what we're doing actually is creating a creative hub that keeps on giving. So how do we continue to export creativity and export hope through powerful projects and allow people who are, at different journeys in their life, a place to create events and to belong. And we're not just exporting projects, but we're actually exporting a culture. So for me, how do we export a culture? Because culture is the most powerful thing. Culture is the most powerful thing I think that you can pass on. I mean, if you look at, again, Jesus, he passed on a culture. He didn't pass on 10 ships and 5 carriages and 3 different houses with gold roofs. Like, he didn't pass that on. He actually passed on a culture, which was a culture of the kingdom. It was a culture of take the shirt off your back. It was a culture of heal the sick. It was a culture of, kindness and loving your enemy. And I think if we can export culture, so the culture export factory maybe is what my ideal life looks like, and where I can give more than I get, and we can see dreams go further than where mine even went.
Mate, I'd love that. Absolutely love that. That's quite brilliant. And let's face it, that's a culture that's now survived and growing strongly for over 2,000 years. So how powerful is culture in the context of, if we talk long-term and generational infinite impact, then nothing greater than to create an enduring culture and one of kindness and giving. Absolutely love that, mate. Brilliant, mate. I'm going to switch into what I refer to as the bushfire lightning round or the ambush series, which are just 5 quick questions that
I like that.
The guests love to gain your insights on. Mate, first of those is, what's your favourite quote and why?
My favorite quote, I'm just gonna bring it. It's really the quote that Jesus said, and I know I keep throwing his name in there, but he said that why do I tell stories? He said, I tell stories to create readiness in a generation that's not ready. And so I'm like, so I think, to me, that quote says, what are we supposed to be readying in another generation? What are we actually supposed to be creating readiness in the society that's around us? And he knew what he was doing. The other quote, just to throw it in there, is when Steve Jobs said the number one most powerful tool business can have is the power of story. Yep. And I'm like, those two things match pretty good. I know Steve Jobs and Jesus are completely worlds apart, but in terms of what they did, but those two quotes kind of come together.
Yeah, and I love the first one, that readiness in the next generation, and be able to use the power of story to shift thinking is a very powerful one, mate. Yeah, awesome. Moving into the literary field, but what's the top book that you'd recommend and why?
Top book is Creativity Inc., and Ed Catmull wrote it. And Ed Catmull was the CEO of Pixar, still is involved, and it just really shaped the culture of the way that I lead, the way that I build teams.
Love that. I'm an absolutely rabid reader, and that's one I haven't read, mate, so that's going to go straight on the Kindle tonight.
Yes.
Creativity Inc. Yep. Yep, thank you, mate. I'd love to have a good look at that one. Now, this one's a little bit left field, and it almost seems out of place, but a lot of hardworking Aussies often feel that they pay way too much tax. So what's the top legal thing that you've done to minimise the tax that you pay, mate?
I've had kids, 4 kids. I know that's probably not the best answer.
I love it. No, I love it.
Yeah.
That's a very good one, mate, in fact. I'll move straight on from that one because there's probably no need to expand on that. Back on the sort of the investment topic, I'd love you to share, and this can be investment in anything, by the way. What's the worst and the best piece of investment advice that you've ever received today?
The worst investment advice that I've received is do what everyone's doing.
Yeah.
And I was in college and someone told me to invest in a 401k, and I don't think that's wrong. But I started, you start seeing like how some of these things actually aren't going to be valid in the future. I know people that they base their investment on fear. And I'm not saying it's wrong because I have life insurance and things like that. I didn't for a long time because no one would give it to me where I lived.
Yeah.
But I've seen so much investment based on fear. So I'm going to invest in this in case this happens. Yeah. I mean, that's just fear. And so I would say that's probably the worst advice I've gotten is make sure you're covered everywhere. I'm like, man, and this could be very controversial, but I think that's probably the worst advice I've gotten. Yeah. The second on why. What was the second question?
Yeah, so the best piece of investment advice that you've received.
It's probably what that investment banker told me, where he said, "Invest in people, never a project." Yeah. And I've always done that. So we invested in a microfinance company as a family a few years ago, and what more than the return, more than what the company is doing, is the richness of the relationship and the impact that it's having. I sat across the table from this guy and I said, "Look, your numbers are fine. We've had them vetted, but I can look you in the eye and there's something that I believe in you about, and I would do that head and shoulders every day. Invest in people."
Totally, and read people so that you know what their genuine intent is.
Yes.
You can't hide that. I've never met anyone who can disguise things that well that you can't pick what's really going on by just sitting there and looking into their eyes.
That's so good, yep.
Yeah, 100% agree. Mate, coming back to you personally then, what's a happy habit or a rewarding ritual that you've developed over the years that you think's contributed so much to your success today?
I always plan adventures. So I feel like life should be an adventure. And the moment it starts becoming boring or without mundane or without risk, I think it's easy to sort of take out all the emotion in life. And someone said this to me the other day, that comfort will kill you. And so I actually plan getting out of comfort. I plan my days where I get out of my comfort zone. So it's actually planned. Some people think, at some point I'll just be able to get out of my comfort zone. I think what I do is I plan my discomfort, if that makes sense.
Love it. Yeah, absolutely.
And then I work out 3 times a week without fail.
Yep. Great advice, mate. Well, one of the things I've started doing in recent months when we talk about discomfort, I force myself to have a cold shower. It's as simple as that, is because I want the mind and the body to get shaken up. And I've sort of read a little bit about Wim Hof, if you've ever heard anything about him and his breathing techniques and whatnot. He's a really interesting guy. And I mean, he's all about reinvigoration by constantly challenging yourself to put yourself in uncomfortable situations. So, and let's face it, that's a microism of change. If you're always putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, then you're going to learn from that change and improve as a result. So, mate, I love that. I love the whole idea.
That's a good way of saying it.
Planning your discomfort, mate. That is absolutely brilliant, mate. Final question, and again, I feel like we've only just touched on a lot of subjects today, mate. So if you're open to it, would love to get you back at some stage, because there's some topics that we could really do a deep dive on that I know the listeners would love to share your wisdom on. But
happy to do it.
Yeah, to sort of bring it to a summary, if I gave you a microphone that spoke to every single one of the 7.7 billion people that are currently alive in the world, and I gave you 60 seconds to talk, what would you say?
I'd come back to the creator. I would say that creation has a starting point, and that the creator's design is more powerful than your strategy. The creator's story is more powerful than your narrative. And take the lens of the truth of what could be, the imagined statements of what's been put on the inside of you from birth, and choose to focus on life with that lens, as opposed to all the facts that tell you to be afraid, that tell you that you can't, that tell you that we are spiraling as a society, and to focus on the story that is already designed. Because I think, I believe in creation, I believe there's a creator, and I feel like there's an ultimate purpose in every single person's life. And there's a gift that everyone's been given. They didn't earn it, they didn't have to work for it. And so it's designed in you. And if you can follow that design, it's going to be so much easier and so much more fulfilling than the best strategy in the world. And so follow the design, not the strategy.
Love that, mate. And the sort of underlying undentable faith, hope, and belief that creates enables you to pretty much handle any situation that life throws at you, because you're ready for it, you're expecting it, and you're putting false expectations on where you're at and what you want to happen.
Yes.
Absolutely brilliant, mate. Been very enjoyable, mate. I'm going to thank Monty heartily for giving me the opportunity to get you on board. You've got some amazing insights, but also I just love your creative ability to come up with very, very subtle but very significant tools and mechanisms that almost seem so simple that you wouldn't believe they'd have the power, but that's where their strength lies. And would love you to keep sharing those with us. And I'm going to be coming back to you to talk about the Anonymous Generosity Group.
Come on.
Yeah,
let's go, Sonia.
Absolutely, mate. We won't tell Sonia. We'll just make sure that we get it done for her, mate. But really appreciate you spending some time today, mate. And
it's been an honour.
Yeah, likewise, mate. And looking forward to talking to you again in the future. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Bushy. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Tommy.
Bless you.
Well, freedom fighters, how good was that? To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. It's hello@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/Get Invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening. And as always, dream as if you live forever and live as if you die